It is time for Webinar Monday, and today's topic, obviously, is venture through a vernal pool. And I'm hoping you are joining me probably for one of two reasons, right? You either love vernal pools as much as I do, or you have no idea what a vernal pool is and you're here to learn. Either way, I'm excited that you're with me today, and I hope we learn a lot together. If you've been with me before, you know this already, but I do want to stop in case there's anyone new so that you can learn too. But you can either scan that QR code right there or go to our website, portageparkdistrict.org, and that will take you directly to sign up for the newsletter. I think you should do that because it comes out the first Thursday of every month. It's just one email, but it has everything that's going on in the parks. It has the education calendar and all the good updates. So it's a really good source of information. While you're doing that, I'm going to share our mission with you. So our mission is to conserve Portage County's natural heritage and provide opportunities for its appreciation and enjoyment. So the main word there is to conserve. We want to keep Portage County looking like Portage County. We want to protect all of our vernal pools. And that second part is my job, right? To provide opportunities for you so that you can fall in love with it even more if you already do, but little by little so that you can help us conserve it as well. Okay. So now that everyone's signed up for the newsletter and is going to get all the information in a timely manner, let's go. So if you are not familiar with vernal pools, right, and you've walked down a path and you've come across something that looks very similar to that, you might have thought, well, that's a big old puddle, okay? And at first glance, yeah, that's what it looks like. But if you were to ask what is a vernal pool, my answer would be it is a magical place because there is so much more going on under the surface than any one of us can see from this picture. It's teeming with life and they're so subtle about it, right? It has all these characteristics that we can't even see just under the surface and in water that's not very deep. So I do think it's a magical place. For those of you that need a science definition for what is a vernal pool, the first thing I would say is it's a wetland, right? Because we know if we're going to have a wetland, it has to fit three criteria, okay? In order to be a wetland, it has to have hydric soils, so have water in them, okay? So if you were to dig them up, they'd be super moist. They wouldn't really smell very great because all of the anaerobic bacteria in there releasing the gases in order to make them smell bad. But that happens because when it's submerged in water the whole time, the pore spaces that usually have water in there, that usually have air in there, are now filled with water. Okay, so that's what a hydric soil is. Sorry, that was a roundabout way of answering that. The second thing you need to be wetland is to have water-loving plants. So the plants that are growing in any wetland, whether it's a vernal pool, whether it's a pond, whether it's a swamp or a marsh, right? They have plants that like having their feet wet, okay? They can survive having a little bit more water than other plants, okay? And the third thing you need in order to be a wetland is to have water at the surface for some type of the year. It may not have to be the whole year, but you have to water at the surface for some part of the year. Okay, so those are the three things you need to be a wetland. And for vernal pools, they qualify and hit all three of those check marks. Okay, the other thing we'll need to explain is vernal, right? So vernal means spring, and that's when these are really happening and hitting their heyday. Okay, so we have all this precipitation coming in, whether from the spring rains or from the snow melt, and that's how they're filled. Okay, they're filled by that precipitation. There are these shallow depressions in the landscape that fill with that precipitation, and for the most part, they're filled throughout the spring. That's why they're called vernal pools. Now, if you look at them throughout the season, they can have water throughout the summer, well into the fall. They might have it all year round, but they don't have to. There are some vernal pools that will be really moist for all of spring, but by the time August and September comes, especially if we've had a drier summer, then they're going to dry up and it's just going to look like a flat landscape with no water there. So it does not have to have water the whole year in order to be considered a wetland. Okay. And then the other thing that qualifies it as a vernal pool is the fact that our organisms, like our amphibians and our macroinvertebrates, can lay their eggs there and they're relatively protected. Okay, so because they're vernal pools and they have the potential to dry up at the end of the season, that would not be a great place for a fish to live, right? If you're a fish, you know you need water all the time. So they're not going to get there and they're not definitely not going to survive there if by happenstance they happen to be released there, right? But that's a really good thing if you're an amphibian or a macroinvertebrate that's going to lay your eggs there. That's one less predator that they have to worry about. Okay, so that's a vernal pool. If you want to stick with the fact that they're just a magical place, that works for me too. So even though they have one less predator because the fish aren't there, that does not mean that life is easy, right? We know life in nature can be hard. And that's because the organisms that we're talking about are going through metamorphosis. So they rarely are in a race against time. Okay, so from the moment they lay the eggs, those eggs have to hatch and develop and go through metamorphosis in order to become an adult. Because if they're still in the amphibious part of their life, the part that is completely dependent on water, then they're not going to survive if we get to late summer and there's no water there at all. So you can see this picture from the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management that in the winter, yeah, it's all iced over. In the fall, there might still be some water. And then in summer, then it could completely dry out depending on how much precipitation there is and how much heat there is evaporating the water that's there. So, um, I guess I did those out of order, but you guys get it, right? So at the end of summer, there it's going to be dried out, and then in fall, when those fall rains come, in winter, it's going to fill back up again, and definitely in spring. But by the time summer rolls around again, it can be uh, dry as a bone. Okay. And not only is the fact that the weather or the water is receding is problematic for these organisms, but there's other threats as well, right? If we get to winter and then you have some late season freezing events or snow, that can kill off small organisms. And then there's other predators like our snakes and our birds and our mammals that are all going to go in and enjoy eating the critters that live there. But all of the organisms that live here generally have a high fecundity, meaning they're going to lay a lot of eggs. And you know, the more eggs that you lay, the more likely you are that at least some of them are going to survive. So that allows for more chance, a higher chance for successful reproduction. Okay. So I think most of us nature lovers, when we think about amphibians, this little kid is our representative, right? You can see him holding a wood frog in that picture there. He's very excited. He just caught it out of the vernal pool. And if you love amphibians, you know that feeling. So you can see the three that I've posted here, we're going to talk about, but these are our earliest callers. So if you go out right now, you're going to hear them. I have a vernal pool in my yard, and if the temperature is anywhere above 60 degrees, I'm going to sleep with my window open just so that I can hear all of these calling. So I'm very lucky to have a vernal pool right here by my house. The first one, of course, is a spring peeper. And if you can't find a vernal pool, just go for a walk and listen. And chances are you're going to hear them before you even see the vernal pool. So they're really good indicators, and they'll tell you exactly where they are. They're so loud, right? To talk specifically about the frog a little bit, their scientific name is Pseudacris crucifer. And if you look, you can kind of see it in this side view. He has a cross on his back, and that's where his scientific name comes from. And that's one of his key characteristics. If you see a tiny frog in a wetland, sometimes in the wood later in the season, but find the X on its back, you know it's a spring peeper. Okay. I think here's your warning. I'm hoping the sound works. If it doesn't, let me know in the chat. Let me make sure I enabled the chat. All right. Hopefully no one was trying to communicate with me prior to that, but the chat is open. So if the sound doesn't work, let me know. But here's your warning. The spring poopers are loud, and if it works, they should be calling to you in a second. It's It works. Thanks, Bridget. Good. Glad someone confirmed it. So that's the call. So whether you knew that or not, I'm sure anyone who's spent any time in Northeast Ohio has heard a spring peeper. So that's what you're listening to there. And again, they can be super loud, especially if you have a full chorus of them. You have this huge population of spring peepers. They're going to call, usually in triplets. Three of them are going to trio together, but they can be super, super loud. And if you've ever come across them in a culvert or some sort of metal pipe, you better watch your ears. Um, uh, I think the picture I want to show you. So even though they can be super deafening, look how small they are, right? They can fit on a quarter, yet they can make this huge sound that just carries. But even though they're so small, I think this is one of my favorite facts about them. The fact that they're so small. And when you think about defending a territory, right, you know that like bears and bobcats, they can have a couple kilometers that they're going to claim as their own. This little guy is going to find an area and defend 1 foot in diameter, and that is his world that he's going to defend. So I think it's cute to think about the perspective of how small he is, and he's just going to defend 1 foot. It's super tiny, but that just adds to their cuteness. All right, let's not do the sound yet. So here we have the Western chorus frog. This is another one of our early spring callers. His scientific name is Pseudacris tricereata, and he's called that because he has these three dark lines that go down his back, so that's where he gets that scientific name from. Um, the sad thing, um, it's only sad because of human interference, but the Western chorus frog, like a lot of our amphibians, have a strong fidelity to where they were born. What that means is that where they hatched as eggs, they will go back to that same wetland year after year after year in order to mate and lay eggs of their own. Okay. The problem with that is we know that humans come through and we clear out spaces, right? And unfortunately, a lot of times it can be a wetland. But they found that the fidelity for their birthplace is so strong with Western chorus frogs that they have found them trying to mate in developed areas, like housing developments. So let's say they were born in a wetland, and then in the next year or two, someone has come through and made a housing development and cleared that wetland. They'll still go back to that same area and try to mate, even though the wetland is no longer there, right? And you can see why that can have really detrimental factors on some of our amphibian populations, right? So with their sound, though, I find it very interesting. So they're the ones that sound, I've heard it described as a like a creaky rocking chair, but the one that sticks out most in my brain is, you know, those like plastic black combs that people use, and you would run your finger down it, right? So picture running your finger down a comb, and then can you hear? If not, then a creaky rocking chair works too. Okay, this one, I have a soft spot for all three of these frogs, but this one I think is my favorite frog of all of the ones that we find here in Portage County. So this is a wood frog, and it's aptly named because once it mates in that vernal pool, then it takes off into the woods, and it needs a pretty dense canopy cover. They do like thicker woods. So they come to the vernal pool and they're going to reproduce. And then once they're done, then they're going to hop off. They're going to be quiet the rest of the year and they're going to live their life in the woods. So usually in the summer, if I'm leading a nature hike through the woods, 9 times out of 10, if I find a frog, it's going to be a wood frog that we come across, which is great because they're super cute and they're fun to talk about. One of people's favorite facts about them, and the other ones we've talked about, is the fact that they can freeze completely solid. So they have the capability of producing extra sugars in their blood system that's going to act kind of like an antifreeze, right? They're going to be able to protect their cells with that glucose and freeze completely solid. And because of that, they're the only frog that's found north of the Arctic Circle. So if you were to dig up a wood frog in your yard in the winter, you'd be able to knock it on a desk and it would sound hard like an icicle, right? They freeze completely solid. And then in the springtime, when the sun comes out and the temperatures start to warm, they're going to start to thaw out. And for reasons still unknown to scientists, their heart is going to restart and they're just going to hop away. How fascinating is that, right? My coworker Becca says it's great to still have some mysteries in nature, right? It's wonderful that they can survive that harsh winter and just hop away. If you're into biomimicry, this is another great example they, because they can freeze solid and their cells are still intact, they're a really good candidate for doctors to study for like organ transplants, right? So we know that it's very important that the organ you're getting has to be viable, even if the trip is really long. So if you need a heart here in Ohio, but the only match is in California, you have to have that heart stay viable for the entire trip across the country. And if we can study how wood frogs can freeze completely solid but still be completely fine, then how much more effective would our transplants be if we could mimic that process, right? So I think they're fascinating. Because of that, they are our earliest callers. You usually hear them first if the spring peepers don't beat them to it, but they have a really short call window, right? So usually you only hear them for 2, maybe 3 weeks. Once they're done mating, they're quiet. So you really have to get out there and listen to them. I'm hoping the dip in temperatures today will extend it a little bit longer. But I've only had a couple y'all calling in my yard for a little bit. Hopefully it lasts longer. Okay, here's their call. Oh, that was really short. Let's do it one more time. Listen and think ducks. Okay, cool. So if you think ducks quacking, that can be helpful, right? Because we know we also have wood ducks. And if you hear a duck quacking in the middle of the woods and there's no ducks around, then it's probably a wood frog. Um, Not to confuse you, but wood ducks don't sound like that. They don't quack, but that's just how one way you could remember them. We're done with that. Okay, so if you go out and you come across that shallow depression that has water in it, right? You're going to look out across the surface, and I want you to look here and try to find egg masses, okay? So um, take a second to look at the picture and see if you can find some egg masses. While you're looking, you might already know this, but the word amphibian means dual life. And that's because our amphibians live part of their life with gills in water and then part of their life out away from the water. So that's what amphibians are. If you haven't found them, here's the circle. So in this vernal pool, I believe this was at the back of Dick's Park, but there are two large masses of eggs there. So you have to look carefully because they blend in for a reason, right? They're trying to protect themselves. So, but once you know what to look for, it's pretty simple. Okay. The Eastern American toad, this is another sound of the season and later in the summer that I love because once those early callers, the spring peepers and the chorus frogs and the wood frogs move out, then I find that the American toads come in and fill that area, okay? And more times than not, these are the tadpoles that I find in my yard. So after the early season frogs are done, they're going to come in, but they have a longer season. They're going to mate all the way through June. So it's really nice to hear this kind of early summer sound. And you've probably heard it before. So here's their call. Okay. So it's a really long, high-pitched trill. You might have heard some gray tree frogs in the back that also trill, but theirs is a lot shorter. The one of the toad extends longer. And you can tell this is Eastern American toad because if you look at its dorsal spots, right, these darker spots that you can see on its back, they tend to have one or two warts in there. Okay, so that's another one of their identification keys. Okay. Okay. So if you look here, this picture turned out a little blurrier than I thought, but there are some wood frogs. The female is larger and on the bottom, and the male is smaller and on the top, and they're in a position called amplexus. So when they thaw out and are ready to mate, males will go to the vernal pond first, and they will start calling. So they'll start making that duck quacky sound, assuming they're wood frogs. If they're not, they'll make a plethora of other sounds that we just listened to. And then the females will come in. And if she decides that he is a good mate, then she'll allow him to get in this position called amplexus. So frogs do external fertilization. So she will release eggs, and him being in this position helps her because he can squeeze out the eggs. And while she's releasing eggs, then the male can um, fertilize them as they're leaving. Okay, so they do external fertilization. And you can see around them, there's all of these clumps of dark eggs here. So those are all little baby wood frogs. Um, One way to tell the difference, if you ever come across them, so frogs lay their eggs in clumps. So they're going to be, you could almost scoop under them and pick them up, and they would come in one kind of giant gelatinous mass. Whereas toad eggs are different. They still do in plexus, they still externally fertilize, but toad eggs are going to be laid kind of in this string of pearls situation here. So they're long strands, and you can see them all throughout the vernal pool. So if it's a clump, it's from a frog. If it's a strand, it's from a toad. Okay. And of course, in vernal pools, we have all stages. So the adults are there mating, the eggs are there going through metamorphosis, and then as they get to this stage, the tadpoles and continue to grow. You can find all of them if you go and explore a vernal pool. Okay, let's get into our other amphibians. So let's talk about our Jefferson salamander, right? I just think they're so precious and so interesting, right? How can something this small be so successful and live out its life in the woods, right? And if you haven't seen one of these, that's okay because they're good at hiding, right? They'll be in the vernal pools during mating season, but they're mole salamanders, meaning they spend most of the rest of their adult life underground. So if you haven't seen them, that's why. It's because they're underground. With Jefferson salamanders specifically, when they're not breeding, they tend to live their lives in drier areas. So they're going to be up more in the uplands and not really close to the pools and the wet areas around there. But during mating, the males will again come to the vernal pools, and when he finds a female, he'll kind of rub his head on her head and her face, and it's thought that they're sharing, pheromones that way. And then when the female is receptive, then he's going to deposit what's called a spermatophore. It's this little kind of pocket of sperm along the ground in the vernal pool, and the female will come by and pick it up with her vent, and it'll go into her cloaca. So they actually do internal fertilization, which is different than what the frogs do. But the female has to go and actually pick it up, right? And she'll hold on to that for a day or two before laying the eggs. So it's just an interesting reproductive habit. Okay, I think the star of the salamander world is definitely the spotted salamander, right? They're beautiful. And um, I was at a tack store yesterday, and they have fishing lures that look just like a spotted salamander. Oops, got too excited. But our spotted salamanders, again, they're mole salamanders. They're going to spend their adult life underground. But on warm nights in the spring, they're going to migrate to the vernal pools, and they can come from as far as 100 meters away in order to get to that breeding pool. And they'll come off all over from the surrounding forest, right? They'll come up from underground, travel to their vernal pool, most likely their vernal pool. Oh my goodness, guys. And then they're going to reproduce after that's done. They do it very similar to the way the Jefferson salamanders do. Then they're going to go back and go back underground. So if you haven't seen these either, that's why, right? Okay, so we talked about frog versus toad eggs. Let's talk a little bit about salamander eggs as well. So if you see here, this person's hand is partially underwater, and they're showing us some salamander eggs. And if you remember from looking at the frog eggs, you can see each individual egg separately. With this one, you can see the little black dots, but it's hard to separate the individual eggs, right? That's because salamanders surround their egg masses with another gelatinous coating, so they kind of all look like one. And the shape is a little bit different too, depending on what species you're talking about, right? But because of that extra gelatinous mass, it makes the individual eggs a little bit less noticeable. And whether it's a frog egg or a toad egg or a salamander egg, right, they start off uh, pretty clear, right? But as the season progresses, you might notice they get a little bit more green as algae starts to grow on them. But that is wonderful, free nature camouflage, right? You want the algae to grow on there for protection from other predators and make them less visible. But you might wonder, how does something so small lay so many eggs that are that big, right? And the fact is, they don't. When they lay them, they're a lot smaller, but since they're laying them in water, as they start to absorb water, they tend to get bigger. Okay, so the egg masses that we generally find are they're not looking the same way as when they first came out. Okay, when we talk about metamorphosis, right? Just in general, usually the first picture that comes to people's head are butterflies, right? And you're not wrong. Butterflies go through metamorphosis, but they're not the only thing that goes through metamorphosis. And that's why vernal pools are so important because they allow a lot of our other insects to go undergo metamorphosis in a really interesting way. Okay, and one of my favorite examples are dragonflies. Okay, so if we look here, these are beautiful but vicious creatures that swim all around our wetlands, but they have a really interesting life history, right? So after they mate, they form kind of this copulation wheel. Um, and then the female is going to lay her eggs either in the water, under a leaf, in a plant stem. And after they hatch, they're going to grow into larvae. And you see how beautiful this dragonfly is? Uh, this isn't the same species, but a lot of dragonfly larvae looks like this, right? They're tiny little alien monsters. And when you pull one out for the first time, they really can be unsettling. But you can see they are insects, so they have the body segments and the six legs that are there. And on this one, you might even be able to see where the wings are starting to grow. They're underwater, so they don't need those wings yet, but they're growing and they're undergoing metamorphosis, so they're making space in order for the wings to start to grow. Okay, this is probably the gnarliest thing that's going on in the vernal pool. So if you're looking at a dragonfly larva, right, they're gonna sit under a leaf litter or by a rock, and they're gonna wait. And they're gonna wait for some yummy piece of food to travel in front of them. And then they have this extendable bottom jaw called a labium. And as that piece of food travels in front of them, it's going to shoot out and grab them and bring it back in, right? It's it's such an interesting way to capture food. And if you were to capture one of these, you can kind of use your finger to push it down and you can see that labium. You don't want to hurt it, but it is visible, right? But in general, it goes out and it could pull that food back in, right? So that definitely seems like something out of an alien movie, right? Okay, after they've gone through metamorphosis and they've gone through their instars, right? They're going to shed their skin and keep growing. When they're ready, they're going to crawl out of the water and attach themselves to a piece of vegetation. Then let's go back to this picture. The the back part of them is going to start to dry and it's going to split open, okay? And from there, the adult form is going to emerge, okay? So when you look here, the one on the bottom is the instar that was living in the water. You can see the back where it's open a little bit, and then the one on top is the adult that crawled out of that, right? If this isn't the thing that alien movies are made out of, I don't know, guys. But you can see here, do you see these white strings? Those are called tracheal tubes, so that's how they were breathing before. And the wings, this one must have been sitting here for a little bit because its wings are rather puffed up. But um, when they first come out, their wings are all folded up and they need time in order to put blood into the wings and stretch them out. But this adult came out of that dragonfly nymph. And it's one of the coolest processes. So if you ever have the chance to be around a wetland at night, near a river or a pond, maybe on your own property, just go out on the edge and start looking for these things later in the season because you'll be able to watch them. And because they need to allow their wings and their exoskeleton to harden, they have to sit there for a couple hours before they can fly away. So they're super, super vulnerable. So they're not going to move around a whole lot, so it would be a good time to carefully spot them. But this is one of the coolest things, in my opinion, that's going on in nature. It's all happening in those vernal pools, right? Okay. Damselflies do the exact same thing, but in my opinion, their nymphs don't look as terrifying. So you can see they have these three tails here, right? And they're still insect-like, but they don't bother me as much as the dragonfly nymphs do. Okay. In case you didn't know, when you go to look at the adults around your vernal pools or around your other wetlands, you can tell the difference usually between adult dragons and adult damsels, and it's all in the way they land. Okay, so with the dragonfly, you can see here on the left, the wings when they land are spread out, right? Just like an airplane, they're going to be out from their body when they land. Whereas if you look at the insect on the right, that's a damselfly, and you can see they close up and they go in line with their body when they land. So that's one way to tell the difference. Okay, for anyone who doesn't like spiders, here's your warning that the next slide has a very large spider on it. Okay, it is a large spider, but it is beautiful. This one is a fishing spider. So we started with our insects. Spiders are not insects, okay, but they are still in our vernal ponds and in our other wetlands as well. I think I already said that this one is a fishing spider, and I think you can infer from its name that it's really good at hunting on the water, right? So they can swim, they can run over the water, they can dive underneath the water, and they're excellent hunters. They are going to stalk their prey. They don't build webs like our orb weavers do. They're actually going to follow their prey and hunt them down. I don't know if that makes them cool or scary for you, but hopefully it makes them cool, right? There is one species that we have called the six-spotted fishing spider, and they're capable of trapping air bubbles on their legs so that when they do dive, they can breathe underwater when they go to hunt for things, and they can hold their breath for 30 minutes. That's, I don't know what that is. That's incredible, right? We weren't in a vernal pool because that's too small to kayak in, but we were on at West Branch. My husband and I, we were kayaking, and we joke. So I said, "Haha, honey, look, there's a snake there," because he's not big on snakes. And he goes, "Well, that's funny because there's an actual spider on your boat." And I thought he was joking, but he was not. There was a fishing spider, probably about the size of my palm, with its legs on my kayak, right? And, when you're in water, that's not where you want a giant spider to be. It's on the same vessel as you. So I used my oar to kind of splash it off, and, much to my dismay, it swam away. I've never seen a spider swim, but take it from me, these guys actually do. Okay, so everything the insects and spiders we've been talking about can be classified as macroinvertebrates, but there are others that we usually just kind of lump into this group. Macro means big, and invertebrates means without a backbone. So these are things we can see without our naked eye that do not have a backbone. Okay, like our beetles. Okay, so if you look on the left, that is our predaceous diving beetle, and you can tell by its name that it is a good predator, whether it's in its adult form or its larval form. They're really good hunters. And the one on the right is the much cuter named whirligig beetle, right? So there is its larva. And for the predaceous diving beetle, you can see its larva. So you can tell whether, even if it's a larva, right, or a nymph, it has these gnarly mandibles, so it's going to be able to catch some things. Um, with them, they usually stay in and around the vernal pool the whole time. And as it starts to dry up, like if it goes into winter, then they're just going to overwinter in that dry basin and then wait for the water to fill back up later in the season. And then they'll go on their way again. Whirligig beetles you can see in pretty much any type of wetland, right? And you probably have, if you've noticed insects on, or yeah, beetles on the top of the water literally whirling around in what seems like endless circles that they don't seem like they know where they're going. Those are the whirligig beetles. And they're really cool because they have specialized eyes so that they can see both above and below the water. So they can look out for predators from both sides. What I learned and was able to experience for the first time this summer is that if you're able to catch them, maybe if you scoop them up at like a baseball cap and sniff them. I know that sounds weird, but if you sniff them, they smell fruity, like apples. Okay, so put that on your summer bucket list. Sniff a whirligig beetle and tell me if it smells fruity to you. Okay. Okay, so for our snails, most people may not find snails interesting, but uh, ODNR has a whole book just on these critters, and you'll be amazed at how many different versions of shells these things can have, right? And you know that the shells are used for protection, but it's also really helpful when the water levels start to get down in our vernal pools. It's going to help keep them moist and help them survive. They do breathe air, but they can go underwater for a good period of time too. Okay, but they will have to come up eventually to take a breath of air. And if you want to get deep down into it, you can determine whether a snail is invasive or native just by looking at the opening and which way the shell is going to swirl. So that's one thing to start to study. Okay, when we talk about worms, let me grab a drink of water here. Uh, Aquatic worms, in my opinion, nothing to write home about because they are so plentiful. When we go out and catch things with program participants, in the beginning, everyone's excited to say, "Oh, I got a worm! Oh, I got a worm!" But after like your 100th worm in 5 minutes, then they're not as exciting anymore. So you'll be able to find them, no problem. These ones, however, are interesting. Excuse me. So caddisflies are so cool. So when they're in this form, they are going to build little houses for their protection. Okay, so obviously these rocks are a little bit prettier than what we might find at the bottom of our vernal pools, but they do this by going around and collecting things on the floor of their habitat and using silk that they produce to glue them together to make this little hut, okay? And the type of hut they make is completely dependent on what substrate is around. So you can find them with little rocks, right? But most of ours that are in vernal pools, they usually make them out of little leaf litters and twigs, okay? So they're gonna look a little bit different than us. And there are lots of different types of caddisflies, and the majority of them prefer running water, but we can find a couple in vernal pools. But it's cool because no matter what program we're doing, whether we're dipping in a vernal pool or if we are, in the Cuyahoga River doing river studies, we're going to find caddisflies. So they're really interesting. But like I said, the casing that they make is completely dependent on what is available to them. So people have found that if you have caddisflies and you put them in a enclosure, I guess, Some people have put gold in there in little jewels, and they make these beautiful little houses. And then the people will take the houses and turn them into jewelry. So you can get yourself your own pair of caddisfly earrings or maybe a necklace because people will give them different types of substrate and they'll make these beautiful pieces of work, right? And they're just inside of there, so it's not really going to hurt them, or maybe they have even passed on and metamorphosed to the next level. But people will take them, and now you can have earrings that look like that. Cute. Okay, so when we talk about fish flies, not a lot is known about them, but they are noticeable. Okay, so when you find them, you're going to know that you have one because they're just massive compared to some of the other things that we look at. They have this shiny head you can see there at the bottom of the picture and these big mandibles. So they are good hunters. But like I said, not a lot is known about them. But when you find one, you're going to know it because they stand out. It's not like the little things that you're looking underneath the leaf litter. It's going to, you flip a leaf over and there's this giant thing staring back at you. They're super cool. Okay. And another alien-looking creature is our giant water bug. Um, you might have also heard them called a toe biter, right? And you can see why. So they have those front forelimbs that they're going to sit and wait and they're going to grab whatever comes in their way, right? And they can really deliver kind of a mean pinch that way too. But they get pretty big. They can be about 2.5 inches long, right? You can see someone's finger compared to this one here. Okay, so those front legs, as something moves by, it's going to capture that prey, and they're able to inject these salivary enzymes. They're going to help them take down prey that's much bigger than they are. So these water bugs or toe biters, whatever you want to call them, they can take down tadpoles, they can take down frogs, they can even take down small fish because of those enzymes that they have, right? So crazy things going on, guys. Okay. So if you look at the isopod on the right, that's our aquatic isopod, and you might think it looks like the potato bug or roly-poly or whatever you like to call them on the left. And you're right. Okay, they're both crustaceans, right? They both need water in order to survive because they have gills, right? These are more closely related to lobsters than they are to insects. So they are crustaceans, okay? But they're herbivores and they're detritivores. So they eat the plant matter, but they're also helping the ecosystem in which they live because they're breaking down that plant matter so it doesn't accumulate. And also so other organisms, like our tadpoles, can eat the plant matter as well. So they're helpful. Okay. You might not recognize this organism in this form, but I'm sure you've seen it in this form if you've been anywhere up on the lake at any time, right? So mayflies are known for, let me go back to this picture, for having 3 tails. And when they emerge, they're going to emerge in their adult form like this. Excuse me. And usually they emerge roughly at the same time and in huge numbers. Okay. So, I know maybe 10 years ago, I was up around Put Bay, up on the islands up there, when some of these emerged. And when you drove on the road, you can hear them being crunched because they were just in the thousands and they were everywhere, right? They'd be on the building sides, they'd be on your clothes, they'd be everywhere. They're not harmful, right? They don't have mouths, so they can't bite you. It's just kind of icky to have that many things crawling all over you when you're trying to enjoy yourself outside in the summer. You heard me say that they don't have mouths. So the adult form, right? They come out of the water and they can't eat, so their only purpose is to reproduce, right? But they do provide a really good food source for birds in that area at that time. So there are mayflies. And this end with an obvious one, right? Just like the worms, if you go out, more than likely you're going to catch mosquito larvae as well, right? And I will be the first one to say I hate mosquitoes because I will be a human blood bank whenever I'm out in any type of warm weather, right? I got a mosquito bite 2 weeks ago, okay? They just know where to find me. But Like all things in nature, they do have a purpose, and they're really good prey for our salamanders and our frogs and our birds and our dragonflies. Everything is going to eat them, right? So they do have a purpose if you think about them in that regard. Okay. So I know I covered the basics, but I did not even scratch the surface of the things that you can find in a vernal pool. Okay, so what I would encourage you to do is to come to one of our vernal pool explorations and hang out with us there because we provide a safe way for you and the organisms in order for us to absorb them. And I put this picture there to show you that it's fun for all ages. So yes, I do have 4 and 5-year-olds running around screaming that they found these cool organisms, but you can see that even the adults get into it and are fascinated by what they're finding in the water. So don't let it discourage you if you think it's just for kids, because it's not. We all love vernal pools. When we talk about vernal pools, like all of our habitats, right, they do have certain threats that they have to deal with. And for them, because they are relatively small bodies of water, the pollution and the pesticides and the herbicides really can add up, right? And I know people, when they put these things out, they might be targeting one thing and may not mean to have harm on other things, but we don't always think about how far-reaching our effect can be, right? So if we put in something just to kill mosquitoes, then maybe it might take out something else if you're not careful. Okay, so you really have to pay attention to what you're putting in and where. Climate change and habitat loss is the same for everybody. It doesn't matter what organism we're teaching about. Everything is being affected by these changes that we're seeing, right? And especially habitat loss for our vernal pools, right? So Ohio has lost over 90% of its wetlands, and much of those are vernal pools, right? So when people look at them, they don't consider them wetlands because how can it be a wetland if it doesn't hold water all year long? But the truth is they are. And as you just saw over the last couple slides, they're teeming with life, right? But people don't always view them that way. So they think, okay, what's the big deal if I dry up this area, right? Who's really going to be affected? But we know a lot is. Okay. And of course, poaching, right? We know that there are illegal pet trades. People go out into the woods and they catch our frogs and they catch our salamanders and they sell them as pets. So poaching is a huge problem as well. So we have to be careful of all of these things and try to protect the things that are living there. So, how can you help? Number one, stay on the path, right? We have paths in our park for a reason, okay? And that's one, to keep you safe, but also so that we have minimal disturbance on the organism's habitats, right? The other thing is if you do come across an organism, don't touch it. Okay, so a lot of our amphibians breathe through their skin. They have this permeable skin. And if you have anything on your hands, if it's lotion or hand sanitizer or bug spray, they're going to take those chemicals into their body through their skin. So we really have to be cognizant of what's going on if we attempt to touch them. And it's just better not to. Okay. And then another thing is community science, right? So we are a chapter, Portage Park District has their own chapter of Frog Watch USA. So the season has already started, but I encourage you to join us next season where you come to a training. We'll teach you 11 frog and toad calls of Portage County, and then you go out and you observe active frog and toad populations. And what that helps us do is monitor where these populations are, if the phenology of their calls is changing, and if we're seeing different species come in as well. Okay, so I hope you join us next year for that. For some resources, this book is great. My lamp isn't on, but if you can see this, it's a really cute book. It has a lot of information on it. There are tabs at the bottom that has a bunch of different organisms that you can find, even more than I talked about today, but it's all about Ohio's vernal pools. Another thing, if you want to get good at your Pocket Macro, or if you want to get good at your macroinvertebrates, download this Pocket Macros app. It is free. There's flashcards on there already built in. There are quizzes on there, and then there's just learning tools. So you can go and get really good at the larval or the nymph stage versus the adult stage of these different organisms that we're finding in there. Okay. A website that I highly encourage you to go to is macroinvertebrates.org if you want to learn more about those. And of course, come to park programs. So we do have some, what are they called? Stream exploration programs coming up. We also are going to do river health workshops, and with the exception of some of the frogs that are going to be done by then, a lot of the organisms we just talked about are the same in those other habitats as well. So you can come and learn and practice those. So I encourage you to come hang out with us in the park so we can safely learn about these critters together. Okay. So it's about 7:51. I'm happy to hang out and answer any questions. So feel free to write them in the chat box if you have any questions. If not, I just want to say thank you for joining me this evening. I know it's a little chillier today, but spring is here, right? Give it a couple days and then go explore, okay? But just do it safely. Enjoy the sounds of the vernal pools from the pathway, okay? And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. But thank you for joining me for another webinar Monday, and I hope to see you soon.